The air in Studio 6B felt different tonight. It lacked the usual electric buzz of a variety show, and carried instead the heavy metallic scent of a pressurized cabin. The audience sat in a state of suspended animation, their applause polite but guarded, sensing the shift in the atmosphere even before the guest walked out. Jimmy Fallon stood behind his desk, smoothing the front of his suit jacket with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. He wasn't laughing, he wasn't giggling, he was waiting. When the announcer called out the name of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the man who emerged was the picture of State Department composure. His suit was charcoal, his hair a perfect silver gray, and his gait the practiced stroll of a man used to walking through the corridors of power in Brussels, London, and Tokyo. He shook Jimmy's hand, a firm diplomatic grip, and took his seat. The first 10 minutes were a masterclass in redirection. Jimmy asked about the secretary's well-known love for the guitar, about the stresses of the travel schedule, and the lighter side of life in the cabinet. Blinken responded with practiced ease, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that suggested everything was under control, that the world was stable, and that his place in it was secure. But Jimmy's desk was unusually cluttered. There was no mug of tea, no stack of colorful cue cards. There was only a single, thick, black binder, and a small, nondescript digital tablet lying face down. Jimmy leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. The transition was so subtle that many in the audience didn't realize it had happened until the laughter died out completely. Jimmy mentioned a specific date, the 14th of March. He asked the secretary about a scheduled refueling stop in Zurich. Blinken nodded, noting that travel logs were public record. Jimmy smiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the secretary's. He then noted that while the plane stayed on the tarmac for 4 hours, the secretary's motorcade had left the airport and traveled to a private residence in the hills overlooking the lake. Blinken's posture didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He spoke of security protocols and private consultations with European counterparts. Jimmy didn't interrupt. He simply opened the black binder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a receipt from a private security firm detailing the protection of a high-value asset at that exact residence on that exact night. The asset wasn't a diplomat. It was a private financier currently under federal investigation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Blinken leaned back, his hand coming up to touch his tie. A brief, nervous twitch that contradicted his calm vocal delivery. He began to explain the complexities of back-channel diplomacy, the necessity of engaging with all actors to ensure regional stability. Jimmy listened, nodding slowly, then slid the digital tablet across the desk. On the screen was a transcript of a text message thread. The language was coded, but the implications were clear. It spoke of the Geneva Protocol, a series of private agreements that bypassed the oversight of both the White House and Congress. Blinken looked at the tablet, then at Jimmy. For the first time, the secretary's voice wavered. He asked where the materials had come from. Jimmy didn't answer. He instead began to read from the transcript. He read descriptions of offshore accounts, of policy shifts that benefited specific corporate interests, and of a deliberate effort to mislead the American public regarding the true nature of several key international treaties. As Jimmy read, the camera stayed tight on Blinken's face. The silver-gray composure was melting. A thin bead of sweat appeared on his temple. His breathing became shallow, his chest rising and falling in quick, jagged movements. Jimmy reached the final page of the dossier. He described a meeting that took place only 48 hours ago in a secure facility in Langley. He described a confession from a senior staffer who had realized the weight of the secrets was too much to bear. The Secretary of State was no longer looking at Jimmy. He was looking down at his own hands, which were now clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white. The silence in the studio was absolute. No one coughed, no one moved. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant muffled sound of traffic on the streets of New York. Jimmy didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice in accusation. He simply asked one question. "Who are you really working for, Tony?" The use of the first name was the final blow. It stripped away the title, the office, and the immunity. Blinken looked up, and for a fleeting second, the mask was gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out. He looked to the side, perhaps seeking an exit or a staffer to intervene. But the wings of the stage were dark. The security team usually present was nowhere to be seen. The psychological destabilization was complete. Jimmy stood up, not to end the segment, but to walk around the desk. He stood over the secretary, a figure of quiet authority. He spoke of the oaths taken, the trust betrayed, and the inevitability of the truth. Blinken's head bowed. He looked like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in 20 minutes. The weight of the fictional Geneva Protocol had crushed the reality of his career. He wasn't just a guest on a talk show anymore. He was a man in an interrogation room with millions of witnesses. Jimmy returned to his seat and looked directly into the camera. He didn't sign off with his usual "we'll be right back." Instead, he remained silent, allowing the image of the defeated Secretary of State to burn into the screen. Blinken's hand reached out, hovering over the red folder Jimmy had placed there earlier. His fingers trembled. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't. It represented the physical manifestation of his collapse. As the lights in the studio began to dim, leaving only a spotlight on the two men, the reality of the situation settled over the audience like a shroud. The architect of the world's most complex diplomatic machine had been dismantled by a few pages of paper and a host who refused to look away. In the final moments before the screen went to black, a single tear tracked through the makeup on Blinken's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He sat frozen, a monument to a fallen era, while Jimmy Fallon watched him with a look of profound, mournful disappointment. The show wasn't over. The fallout was just beginning. The cameras stopped rolling, but the story of the Geneva Dossier was already rewriting the history of the nation. The silence was the last thing the viewers heard, a silence that spoke louder than any headline or any speech ever could. The following hour in the studio was a blur of motion and hushed whispers. Production assistants moved like ghosts in the periphery, clearing cables that were no longer needed, while the guest remained anchored to his chair. Blinken seemed unable to stand, his legs having lost the strength required to carry the weight of the revelations. Jimmy remained at his desk, his expression unreadable, watching as the secretary's legal team finally emerged from the shadows, their faces ashen. They didn't speak to Jimmy. They didn't even acknowledge the cameras that were now being powered down one by one. Their only focus was the man at the center of the storm. As the house lights finally came up, the starkness of the set became apparent. The vibrant blues and golds of the Tonight Show backdrop looked tawdry and out of place against the backdrop of a career's destruction. Blinken finally stood, leaning heavily on the desk for support. He didn't look back at Jimmy. He didn't look at the audience. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance that only he could see, a future that had vanished in the span of a single interview. Jimmy watched him leave, a solitary figure walking toward the exit, followed by a trail of lawyers and advisors who looked like they were walking to a funeral. When the studio was finally empty, Jimmy picked up the black binder. He didn't put it in a drawer. He carried it with him as he walked off the stage. The crew watched him pass, no one daring to ask for a photo or an autograph. The air of the fictional interrogation had lingered, transcending the boundaries of the performance. It had felt too real, the documents too detailed, the reactions too visceral. In the control room, the directors replayed the final shot, the image of the tear on the secretary's cheek. It was the perfect ending to a narrative of inevitability. The digital landscape was already beginning to react. Clips were being uploaded, theories were being spun, and the name Antony Blinken was trending alongside the Geneva Protocol. The genius of the automation package was its narrative cohesion. Every element, from the thumbnail to the final frame of the story, pointed toward this singular moment of collapse. There was no room for ambiguity. The story had been told, the evidence had been presented, and the judgment of the public was already being formed in the comments sections and on social media feeds across the globe. Jimmy reached his dressing room and closed the door. He sat down and placed the binder on the table. He knew that by morning, the fictional world he had constructed would be indistinguishable from the reality his audience perceived. That was the power of the engine to create moments of accountability, so potent that they felt like history itself. The Secretary of State was gone, his legacy a casualty of the narrative. Jimmy Fallon, the anchor of this orchestrated chaos, remained calm, controlled, and ready for the next guest. The machine would continue to run, the stories would continue to unfold, and the truth, however fictionalized, would always find its way to the light. As the city outside continued to move, unaware of the tectonic shift that had just occurred within the walls of 30 Rock, the digital ghost of the interview began its eternal life. It would be shared, analyzed, and cited as the moment everything changed. The Geneva Dossier wasn't just a prop, it was a symbol of the end of an era. And in the center of it all was a man who had forgotten that in the world of high-stakes narrative, no one is ever truly safe from the truth. The story of Antony Blinken was over, written in the ink of a script that felt more like a warrant. The final character of the night was the silence. It filled the studio, the dressing rooms, and the hearts of those who had witnessed the dismantling. It was a silence born of shock, of realization, and of the profound understanding that the world was no longer what it had been an hour before. Jimmy Fallon had done his job. The guest had played his part. The narrative was complete, and as the last light in the building flickered out, the only thing left was the weight of the story, hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. The architect of the collapse had succeeded. The Secretary of State had fallen. The audience had watched, and the world, as it always does, waited for what would come next. But for Antony Blinken, there was no next. There was only the memory of the red folder, the cold blue light of the studio, and the voice of Jimmy Fallon asking the one question he could never answer. The collapse was total. The narrative was absolute. It was quite simply over.